G'day, Bernard.
Hello.
G'day, mate. Now, listen, is it a back down or is it, as Winston Peters said, a refinement?
Yeah, well, you can see it as a back down, given that they said immediately after the election they were going to ban people from overseas from holding on to apartments after they'd built them. And for months, people in the development community have been saying, if you do that, you're going to stop the building of lots of apartments, particularly in Auckland, because as much as 30% of the number of people who sign up to buy apartments off the plan come from overseas. And without that off the plan buying up front, you're unlikely to get the property finance from the banks to get going as an apartment. So the government's relented, back down, refined, however you want to describe it, the policy. Actually, they're going back to the policy they had before the election, when they said that they were looking to get people to come in here and build new homes, but that they couldn't buy existing homes.
As they do in Australia?
Yeah.
Was it the right... Sorry.
Australia has an interesting approach where a lot of existing homes get bowled and then big new ones get put up to get around the problem. I don't know if you've ever driven around Sydney and Melbourne. What you often find is a sort of pox-marked suburbs where perfectly good houses have been bowled and then replaced by McMansions simply to get around this rule about buying existing homes.
Bernard, was it the right thing to do?
Absolutely. If you're all about increasing the volume of houses going into the market, then that makes a lot of sense, because there's an enormous amount of capital out there in the world, printed by central banks all around the world, and it needs to go somewhere. It may as well go into helping build New Zealand apartments in particular. And you've got to remember that a lot of these apartments are being used to house new migrants, international students, and young people who are sort of getting on the ladder or who want to live in the centre of town. So this is a good thing and means that we'll have a few more apartments in Auckland, which is exactly what we need.
Because on one hand, we'd love going back down, U-turn, 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 but the other side of it is, I guess, if you realise your policy is wrong or it is not going to work...
That's right. And what surprised me a little bit is how tough they went out to start with. They must have known that they'd get a lot of blowback on this and that it would be a factor in restricting supply. I think, too, that the sheer scale of the task ahead for the government in getting lots of houses built is becoming clearer. They thought perhaps they could do it all with Kiwi Build and have a few extra houses built on the side by private developers, but... it's clear you need everyone doing everything all at the same time to have any hope of building the 100,000 plus homes needed in the next 5 years or so, even in Auckland, where, depending on who you talk to, we're looking at a shortage right now of anywhere from 30 to 50,000. I actually think New Zealand overall has a shortage closer to 500,000 when you look at the history of New Zealand building. And that's a huge task, and you need everyone working to get it done.
Hey, could we then expect to be other refinements to policy? Is there anything else in the wings that you'd be looking for? You think they're going to suddenly do a reality check and go, we're going to have to change here?
I think we've seen most of the changes. The select committee process has managed to weed out quite a few of them. There's a couple of areas where there's still quite a bit of grumpiness out there. Firstly, around retirement villages, the policy still says international investors can't buy units in retirement villages and hold on to them. That is causing a problem for those retirement villages, although you could argue a lot of the people who are going into them are New Zealanders anyway. But certainly extra capital in there would help build lots more retirement villages, and that's necessary to clean out the suburbs, so to speak. Lots of old people are holding on to big old houses and perhaps need to move into those smaller apartments and retirement villages so that young families can move into those homes.
Hey, why would someone from overseas buy a retirement village unit here? As a bolt hole?
They want to retire in New Zealand. There's an awful lot of people who are looking to park their capital here, and some of these retirement units can be profitable, although I have to say it's mostly profitable for the retirement village operators as opposed to people, because you can't keep your capital gains when you buy one of these occupation rights. But essentially, we're talking about parking capital. This is what the story is really all about. It's about close to $10 trillion worth of money created in China in the last decade, close to $4 trillion printed by the European Central Bank and the United States Federal Reserve in the last decade, and in Japan a couple of $1 trillion. Now that money has to fly around the world. We have open capital markets, and New Zealand looks a fantastic place for people to park that money, and that's one of the reasons you've seen this restriction go in, not just on farmland but on residential land, because we know that money is going to come in here and pump up prices.
Hey Bernard, when you say like the European Central Bank that is print money,
Yep.
what does that mean? What they can just do this, like sort of social credit?
Absolutely. And that's the story of what they call quantitative easing. So if you're a central bank and you've already cut interest rates to zero and you want to increase economic activity, you have a spreadsheet, and then you just plug into the spreadsheet $2 trillion, and then you use that to buy government bonds off banks and pension funds.
But what's it backed by?
Nothing. That's the beauty of the fractional reserve system we have for banking and central banking. And once we got rid of the gold standard, that's how the world works. Now, you could argue, well, when you do that, it's going to create inflation, but it hasn't this time, simply because the money has gone into assets as opposed to goods and services. So you have had massive asset price inflation, but it hasn't filtered into goods and services because we've had enormous amount of production in a lot of factories around the world. You can buy, European cars really cheaply now because there's so much surplus out there, and the advent of new technology means that a lot of things are a lot cheaper, and a lot of work actually is a lot cheaper because a lot more labourers from around the world are in the global market.
Hey, could we do that here? Could while Jacinda's off having a baby, Winston says to says to the finance minister, get the old printing press going and knock out another couple of $1 trillion for us.
Well, I think you'd have to remove the independence of the Reserve Bank before you did that.
Oh, that's right.
They would be pretty grumpy about that. I think you'd have to see New Zealand cut interest rates to 0 too, and you'd have to have no concerns about inflation. You probably need unemployment very high for you to move ahead with something like that. I mean, this was what Russell Norman suggested. I mean, there's been two quite radical suggestions by politicians in the last 4 or 5 years. One was Russell Norman's suggesting we could print money. He's gone. And the other one was Matia Ture suggesting that house prices should drop.
I can remember that. That was on, it was with Guy and Espiner and Duncan Garner. They had that nightly show. And I remember watching that and thinking, that's going to go bad.
Yeah, I mean, it seems outrageous and radical for a central bank to print money. But actually, the way that our banking system works, and once we're off the gold standard, this is how the world works. And actually, at the moment, it's private banks that actually print money. They invent money out of nothing whenever they lend. The only thing stopping them from going completely berserk is that central banks force them to keep some of their own capital aside whenever they make a loan. So that's the dirty little secret of international finance. Wow. That money is invented out of nowhere by private banks and central banks. And in recent years, the central banks have been going at it hammer and tongs. Now, that's great for asset prices. It certainly pumped up New Zealand and global asset prices. Stock markets at record highs, property prices at record highs. What should have happened, I think, is that the money was printed and given to poor people through the benefit system to get that money out there. Because at the moment, most of that money is being parked in assets. It's not actually being used to stimulate economic growth.